Okay, so now we are officially being recorded. It's a beautiful morning and a beautiful afternoon and also a beautiful evening because I know you guys are everywhere. As we said before, United Nations of Pronunciation. So here today with me, I have the one and only Victor Medina. He's also part of our committee and we are very, very happy to have him here. He's a good boy. Victor currently works as an academic coordinator at Cultura Inglesa Minas Gerais and is a webinar coordinator at the IATEFL PronSIG. He has an MA in linguistics and a BA in English, both with emphasis on phonetics and phonology. And today he's going to talk to us about intelligibility. So Victor, over to you.
Hey, thank you very much. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good everything, everyone. Okay, let's see. This is, how can I put it? Hopefully it will serve maybe as a refresher for people who are really into intelligibility and constantly reading about it. If you're not so familiar with it, maybe hopefully this will sound clearer by the end of this presentation. And you'll see that and hopefully the references that I will use here, inspire you to read them or, to look into more things if you haven't read about them, because I really hope and I really think they've helped me quite extensively. All right, so let me just make sure there's no the noises. There we go. So this is the title: Understanding Intelligibility in Pronunciation Instruction. And the idea here is to try to at least make it more concrete for us, what it really means to say, oh, I am intelligible. And how do I have to think about those things when I'm teaching pronunciation? Okay. Just a quick outline of what I'm going to be presenting. For this, I'm going to go over very quickly the role of L1 transfer. And this will be very important because when we think of intelligibility, we must think about the reality of the speakers of English, which are, I think I'm not going to be exaggerating in saying that if you have one native speaker of English, you might have three non-native speakers. So we need to bear in mind the L1 of those people. And then we're going to see some ideas behind this concept. What is intelligibility and what things do we need to bear in mind? We'll try and connect it with something some of you might have heard. It's been a major issue in recent years, which is English as a lingua franca. And okay, how am I going to teach with all of those things in mind? And the suggestion is to, well, stop and think about it. And hopefully will make it, make it feasible for us. So let's start with the rule of transfer, which is something that the more I read about, the more, let's say, I feel at ease with the fact that the L1 might be more of a helper than something that will hinder our performance in a second language. One important concept for us to consider is that the learner's L1 and L2 phonological systems, this is something that has been constantly considered and studied, and they're not separate. There are lots of overlapping, there are lots of things which are connected. And this helps us to understand loads of things. And some things that we should consider is something called phonological contrast. And just so you have an idea, only this first set of slides will be slightly more on phonological theory. The rest will be focused on applied knowledge about that. The idea of having phonological contrast is that, okay, so in my brain, I have a set of sounds in my L1, so I know which ones form a category so I do not connect them to others. But then when I read this, when I learn a second language, as those systems will be put together, there'll be things, there'll be characteristics which are shared by them. And as a learner, one of the challenges is to understand, okay, how do I create the category for the L2? An example that we have, for instance, from Portuguese or Spanish is that the sound, not only for Portuguese, because in Spanish they are phonologically contrasted. In Portuguese, the sound for ch does not have a phonological contrast with t. It's one complements the other in our representations. So we have ta, te, chi, for instance. In my area, especially in some parts of the world, in the Portuguese-speaking world, the chi is not even there. So there's that too. So when we learn a second language, when we learn English, well, we have t and ch as very, let's say, clear categories. So we need to. It's interesting because it's a sound we recognize because of the second point here. But then with practice, we should be able to tell, okay, when should I use this one and when should I use that one? So it's already there. It's not something that we have to acquire every detail about it. And then we get to phonetic gradients, because some sounds, when the way we manipulate, if I can say so, the sound when we speak a language varies slightly depending on which sound comes before it, which sound comes after it, and each language will have that. But it's, at the same time, it's interesting because if it resembles something from our first language, we sort of have an initial help. So it's a matter of polishing and reshaping. And this is one of the main, let's say, characteristics of the transference we have from our first language. Another example would be, it's very common, for instance, the sound, the interdental consonants th and the are not very common in several languages in the world. And then when we learn it, it becomes sort of a challenge, because for the phonetic gradients, it might sound similar to, at least to Portuguese listeners, it might sound as an F or as a V sound, or even a T sound. So it takes us a while to, polish that gradients in terms of the phonetic level before we would build a phonological contrast. This one of the negative sides, let's say, or challenging sides of this for us is that a word such as weather, which has the sound, it's not uncommon for Portuguese speakers to associate it with the D sound. And because of that, it's not uncommon for you to hear us saying, the weather is very good today. Because we are, okay, it sounds like a D, so I'm going, and I know that between vowels, sometimes the D becomes a in English. So, the weather is great. This is how we're manipulating that. So you see, it's interesting that we're not just randomly doing anything. We know that there are some phenomena that occur with those consonants. And then we're trying to use the phonological contrast, but we also have to pay attention to this phonetic gradients to see, is this the sound that should be put together with that one? So the use of L1 cues for categorizing L2 sounds could help with that. Now, positively speaking, for instance, we have loads of consonants that maybe we've heard in only a few contexts. That's already something that it's a matter of working with those. I'm using Portuguese because it's my first language, but this could work with several others. In my area, in Brazil, where I am now, the R sound is glottal. So what would happen is that very initial levels, learners would say, for the word door, we would say dor. But in Brazil, in several parts of the country, the R sounds like door. So we even have some differences because of that. So at the same time, then it's something that it's in our passive repertoire. So it's not something completely alien to us. So it's interesting to consider that all of those things help us much more than we could imagine. Now, we need this because the main issue here is, which is probably a common plea of our students, which is, I would like to learn English because I want to be understood wherever I go. But what does it mean to say we understand someone in English? So for this, if you have the chance to read these references, you see there are loads of things about it. But I tried to reduce to 3 simple questions. It's a very short reduction, so bear with me. So the first one is this idea. So to what extent does your listener actually understand what you say? But actually understand is the main words or the most important words in a sentence, or do you actually sound like you're asking a question? The basic thing, the basic units of your utterance, of your speech. Does your listener really know what you're saying there? So one of the things that Derwin, Monroe, Catcher, and Smith considered for this is so the words and the sentences themselves, the basic component of them. So the main stress or the sentence stress, or the most, let's say, the most common consonant, are they articulated in a way that other speakers would understand you? And that would be one attempt at defining intelligibility. So to what extent our listeners actually understand this, actually understand what we say. And it's interestingly based very much to the level of the word and level of the sentence. But there's much more than that, which they propose, these 4 authors propose with something else, which is, okay, I understand the words, I understand basically, well, the sentences are, but how much of an effort is made by your listener to understand what you say? So you see, it's not just about the pronunciation of the words now, it's also about the rhythm, it's about the intention, it's about the pace. And this is interesting, we have another concept of it. So we usually would consider comprehensibility here. So it's not just on, it's not a purely linguistic, concrete level, it's on how those things connect. And last but not least, how much do you understand of what speakers mean by what they say? Here I've shifted from the listener to us because I think it's easier for us to understand it. So how much do we understand what speakers mean? So an example is you arrive at a restaurant, or no, let's suppose this was a live place, a live event. It is live, sorry. A face-to-face event. And then there was an empty chair and someone comes to you and say, is this seat taken? And then you say, it is. But then you don't move, you don't make room for the person to sit. So you see that there's something missing. Or even so, if you said something, is the seat taken? And then you respond, no, it's not. And then you don't move. That would be the logical thing. Right? And then you don't move. You don't make room for the person to sit. So you didn't understand that the person's asking, actually, do you mind if I sit next to you? So we have the pragmatic level here is very important. And for this, they consider the idea of interpretability, which is not always considered in all studies, but considering these 4 authors together, these 3 terms appear quite vividly. So you see, these things would actually, what would be considered for us to be able to say, oh, I understand you. So it's not, so I have to see, do I understand the words, the sentences the person next to me is saying? Do I have to make an effort? Is it difficult? Is it easy for me to understand that person? And do I understand what the person means by what that person is saying? And what is interesting about the idea of intelligibility, which is, you see, it seems to be only one thing, but it's because it's become this buzzword. But so because of this, I'm going to use the word understanding. So the idea of understanding speakers becomes, let's say, more concrete for me, in that what are the things I have to worry about? What choices do I have to make? And I like it because it doesn't excuse native speakers, because our experience will count very much. You see that I'm using the expression the listener. We need to have experience listening to multiple varieties of English, so we're able to understand them. And this might also, and this is interesting because very often it might lead to native speakers struggling to comprehend, which is, as I'm using the tags here, comprehend other native speakers, because they have to make a major effort to understand what they're saying. They don't have the experience. Now, for teaching purposes, then, we have to consider English as a lingua franca here. Basically, one of the main reasons is, well, maybe the most fundamental one is English is used in global communication. When in doubt, you can rest using some English sentences if you're in a country where you don't know that country's most spoken language. But then as a teacher, we would say, okay, what aspects are, let's say, fundamental for teaching? And it's interesting for me because I remember the very first times I started hearing about this idea of English as a lingua franca, and hearing people worried about, oh, well, what about pronunciation? Will we not teach pronunciation? I mean, you can speak every way that you want. That's definitely not that. And this is actually very reassuring, because with English as a lingua franca being something we bear in mind, we have pronunciation goals which are more realistic, because it's not uncommon that some speakers, I'm going to say users of English, some English users would be worried about pronunciation not being taken seriously, if I can say it that way, because we have a tradition of having native speaker pronunciation as our goal. And that's not something that we can actually do, right? Remember, if our phonological systems are not separate, I mean, let alone the phonetic tract here, our vocal tract, we use the same muscles to speak the same languages. As what happens when you exercise the muscles, they develop in a certain way. So it's anatomic. The way we speak is going to influence one language or the other in any way that we can. For the good, for the bad, this is not even something that should be a question. It's a reality. We have one language, we have one body here speaking multiple languages. So it's a matter of that adaptation. And with English as a lingua franca being on the cards, I really have the sense, okay, there are certain things that if we take into consideration, you know, we instead of having a native speaker goal, we have a good enough goal, which is excellent, honestly, but it's just to say, okay, if I check these requirements, it equals to say, okay, there are many people speaking English in the world that might understand me or might see me as intelligible, comprehensible, and interpret what I'm saying. So realistic goals should really help us here, which I'm going to talk about briefly. But I think it's impossible to talk about English as a lingua franca without mentioning Jenkins. There was in 2000, she had a very important paper on that, but in 2009, she wrote something which had lots of connections with teaching, which is why I'm using this one. And just revising, just in case it's new for you, maybe it's just, it's refreshing as well. She considers that we should pay attention to most consonant sounds, so we should be able to articulate that, having English here as our target language. So she doesn't ask us to put in our core the pronunciation of the, and the dark L. And it's also interesting because in this text, she mentioned something that as a person who is interested in pronunciation, and a person in that I try to be as consistent as I am, as I can. I thought, but what about the other sounds? Should I just ignore them? Of course not. And that's interesting. But it's just like it's something she categorizes in the non-core group. It doesn't mean that we should just completely get rid of them, but it's not something that we should be so wary and worried about. Interestingly, she mentions aspiration as something which is important, and it makes a lot of sense because this is important for English because differently from Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, in so many Romance languages, for instance, Slavic languages would have something in that too. The way we differentiate voiced and voiceless consonants is on what we call voice onset time. And in languages like these that I'm talking about, the difference in this category is not reflected in aspiration, whereas in English it is. So what this would mean is for us to produce something into the voiceless group of consonants in English, we would have to aspirate those consonants because we're going to reduce our VOT to a very high level, to a very low level. And when we think of the voiced consonants, their VOT is so low, it almost resembles the voiceless consonants in those L1s that I'm talking about. So it's to say that words such as ball in English, in Portuguese sounds like bola. So the tension for me to articulate the B in Portuguese, I add much more voicing than I would do in English. And this is interesting because when I think, okay, what about the words with P in English? So I would have part, and then in Portuguese I would say parte. So I don't aspirate. I don't have to aspirate to make a distinction in Portuguese. But my Portuguese P is very close in its VOT to the English B. So parte, ball. If I were to record how I'm pronouncing these four words, the level of voicing or the VOT of these consonants of my P and the English B would be very similar. So by learning about aspiration, like forcing ourselves to shift our VOTs, we are able to tackle lots of consonants in English. So the t, even the ch, k, pa, and these are very common consonants. So this helps for the very definition of intelligibility, which is actually understanding the words I'm saying. Vowel length, famous E and I cases of peace and pes, these or this, even though there's also a consonant here, but not quality in that for English as a lingua franca, then, okay, you have to produce something that is understood by a large amount of people. And sometimes maybe, this is quite an interesting thing to consider because by getting at least length right, using these categories, we would have many important sounds, many important words being devoid of misunderstandings. But with qualities, so things such as dog and dog, if we produce something on the back of our mouths which is low enough, it's already there. It's okay. I'm producing something which is in consonance with consistent sound of system sound. I'm sorry. And then most consonant clusters, because it's also characteristic of how English goes, English works. We have loads of triple clusters would be just a combination of consonants. So we have lots of cases of 3 consonants, 2 consonants. And again, using Romance languages, it's very common that we do not have such, let's say, complex combinations. So we usually insert syllables. So a similar famous case for Portuguese would be spring, which is not uncommon for lower level learners to say is spring or springy. even. So we would break it one syllable word into 3 syllables. And for us to be actually understood, again, using the very definition of intelligibility, getting those consonant clusters, well on the way as clusters might increase intelligibility. Would stress for the very same reason. It's not even of course, this is part of understanding, but here, these two should help greatly for the understanding bit. And then again, as I mentioned briefly before, what about the non-core? Here we have 2 very important questions, 2 sides to it. There's the speaker's identity, which is obviously very valid because we come from a tradition of saying this almost brainwashing that you should sound like a native speaker. And then people go, but what about who I am, which is incredibly valid. So covering what I'm calling the basics, which is the core here, should definitely know it's a pact we're making to establish international communication. So I'm doing some things because this language needs, because if I just use what my language has, might not be enough for more people to understand me. So with the non-core characteristics, maybe I don't want to worry so much about saying dog or and cut with this okay, but one thing to consider is covering the core. Okay, we established lots of very effective communication, and the non-core might help. Okay, maybe I want to be able to listen to more varieties of English. Maybe I want to have I want to sound in a certain way, or maybe just because I like learning about pronunciation. So the non-core, which is all the other things, are here to help. But for those people who feel, okay, no, I'm happy with the core with these, and I'm really worried about my identity. Maybe it's a matter of pride. I want to sound like the people in my community. Beautiful. But learning about the non-core can be incredibly beneficial for improving listening skills, because obviously pronunciation is not just about speaking, it's definitely also about listening. So one of the contributions this paper has, which it's available on ResearchGate, for instance, is that, okay, the non-core has lots of benefits for listening comprehension skills. So that you'll be better able to, to decode those sounds. And then she also mentions accommodation, which is, okay, something that we do almost intuitively. But when it comes to English as a lingua franca, we have some challenges. Firstly, native speakers using the same language, using their native language. There are usually effective reasons. Maybe I am in my city, Belo Horizonte, and then I travel to Rio, which is just have to cross some mountains here. It's just an 8-hour drive. For Brazil, this is nothing. And there, people, the way they sound is very different from me. But as a matter of maybe, mingling, I might tone down the way I speak because, well, I want to be understood. And interestingly, she mentions as this desire to be liked by the person next to you. Maybe you're interested in someone from the Northeast. And then with time, as you connect with that person, you start, let's say, tuning the way you speak with that person's way of speaking. Then we have between or among non-native speakers. Our aim usually is to be efficient. We want to be understood. And then when we think of English as a lingua franca, it comes something which is interestingly tricky. So let's say that this give and take in English as a lingua franca tends to become more of giving than taking, because we're going to be exposing yourselves to all kinds of speakers. And that's one of the things that she mentions, that there is usually a focus on the target as opposed to our first language, our characteristics. So it's really about, okay, when you are in this situation in which you are using this lingua franca, so it's almost like, it's like we're going to agree that at this moment, in this space here, we're going to use these characteristics. So we're going to focus on this target that we have. We're not focusing on the person's L1, we're focusing on the target language, English here. Doesn't matter what the speaker is from. So for me, it's sort of reassuring because I don't feel like I have to, if I am in the UK, I have to sound like a person from the UK. If I'm in Australia, I have to sound like a person from Australia. No, I have to strike a deal here. I have to cover some ground in order for me to be understood. And then this leads us to this question. So what do we need to be understood? Something for us to think about. This is something very briefly covered, but then I posted this question here again, because this is probably, if you talk about this to your students, this could be a question they could ask. So what do we need to be understood? And then as teachers, we feel, oh God, how much do I have to know about this now? I honestly feel it's not as much as people like to say. It's that pronunciation, phonetics, and phonology shouldn't be treated as something unattainable. So we'll go back to goals and using John Levis's paper from 2018. Now for the next 15 minutes, I'll be basically quoting him because this is a wonderful work for me to feel, oh, okay, I don't have to be so, obviously need to worry, just like as much as we worry about grammar, we worry about reading comprehension or genre in writing, in teaching writing. So we should pay attention to pronunciation, so it's serious, right? He starts with this bit here. Using language as a social activity and pronunciation is the most public face of language. So this deal that we have to strike, it's in a way where, okay, it's just a matter of being more careful, trying to make an effort into this, because when we are writing, lots of things that maybe the way we say them wouldn't be transposed into writing, and we have many more cues to help us get. Think of our experience as readers and our experience as listeners. We've had far more experience reading in a language than we usually have with listening. Here I'm obviously thinking of English because we're bombarded by English every day, for instance. And then we have to bear in mind that the way speakers speak a language is very important, but then we have to think of how they're understood. We, as teachers, as anyone, spread the word. The way speakers speak a language is real. We all have an accent, and that's fine. We have to accept it. Yes, we do. I have my southeastern mountain-like southeastern Portuguese accent. Taylor, who's here with me in the group, he has his coastal southeastern accent. It's the way we speak. We can't help it, and this is going to influence our English. And then how we are understood is on how we sign that agreement, that deal. So it's not a thing about reducing or eradicating our accent. It should never be about that, but it should be about what should we do? What part of the deal should we sign to be understood? So on the one side, we have accent versus intelligibility. And it's to understand that intelligibility is not something to reshape your accent. It's the way you speak. You're going to sound like you are. It's you. We even have ideas such as idiolects, for instance, that's really unique to how you sound. It's not a battle yet. Intelligibility is focusing on being understood, comprehended, and interpreted. And you see that we have far more than just pronunciation. We have pragmatics, we have syntax, we have semantics. Again, language. And just before I go back to Mr. Levis, we have this trio of wonderful women here, and they have something for us to consider in the classroom. So for frameworks. One thing, because we'll have to teach English communicatively, communicative approach. Yes, but we have, I I forgot the name of the author. Something John as well, another John, I think. He talked about the bricks and mortars as a metaphor for teaching pronunciation. And in that for you, if you just focus, let's say, on the communicative side, on the bricks, okay, well, how are you going to sustain the communication? So the mortars would help. And that would be analogous to the non-communicative activities. So it's to say that these three authors here, they are not going to condemn that sometimes, some drilling here and there or some error correction on pronunciation. It's not to say, oh, it's not communicative enough. We need non-communicative activities to be able to become better communicators. And it's very important that we should consider integrating these skills. So, for instance, if we are thinking of I'm sorry, I lost the train of thought for a second. Coffee. If we're thinking of listening, okay, we're preparing a listening activity for a class, and then we know that some words which will be there, we pre-teach vocabulary. No question, right? It's a very common thing. Why don't we teach the pronunciation of those words? Because maybe the way they sound in the listening track might be very important for my students. And as I showed you before, because if you want to treat native speakers as that model, remember that they will also struggle to understand other native speakers. We have to have experience. So some things that they consider, and I love it because it makes it very realistic for me on the frameworks, is what do we need to know then? It's not once do they mention you should know all the symbols in the IPA. That's incredibly helpful, but you should be able to consult them only. You should know about the pronunciation features. So do I know, for instance, do I know the long and short vowel distinction? Do I know how to aspirate my consonants? It's in the Lingua Franca core as well. So do I know the basics? You probably, if I ask you, do you know present perfect? Do you know what parts of speech are? We have been dealing with that, so we have this here. Awareness of potential student problems. Right, I'm going to Moscow. I probably am going to face my students palatalizing quite a lot. So I have to be able to help tackle them with that difficulty. I'm going to teach English in Argentina. So, okay, I have to pay attention to the fact they're going to break their syllables and put E. So, esport as opposed to sport. Right, I can work with that. It's something that you will listen as you start listening to your students. It's already, again, it's your experience with listening. An advantage that two groups of teachers might have. Those who have the same L1 shared by the students, and those teachers who share the same L1 because we've been there. So this poses a challenge for native speaker teachers because they have to anticipate problems from a language they don't speak. And what are the pedagogical priorities? This would require a bit more. I put this as a third one because it requires a bit more from us. Lots of books we teach with are quite international. So it's not uncommon that they will teach the distinction between B and V, which is totally irrelevant for Portuguese, French, Italian, most Germanic language speakers. But for Spanish speakers, this is gold. They do need it because they don't show a phonological contrast in Spanish for that. So they need to learn that phonological contrast in English. So this is not a priority, pedagogically speaking, for me in Brazil. So it's those things, because we feel, do I have to teach this? When you teach a reading comprehension task, don't you think of what is going to be difficult for your students? So some things you can sort of take for granted because I know they know this vocabulary. I can focus on something else. Maybe you want to teach a different kind of skill. The same would hold true for pronunciation. And what is interesting to consider is it's not to say that we should have only, pronunciation is its own lesson. No, it's about moments. And these terms here are probably quite familiar for you. So description and analysis. After teaching a unit, you realize the students are struggling to pronounce the Z sound in most plural and third person singular forms. Why don't we talk about it for a second? You know, as an extra activity, if you have the time. Listen to discrimination again. We're going to listen to a person speaking about their day, and then you decide to prepare your students. Okay, you're going to listen to these words. Let's see how we say them first. Why not helping our students with that? It's all about scaffolding here. Controlled practice. With if you're teaching tricky sounds to students, we have lots of cases online and of famous sounds which are difficult for students to master. If you feel this is something that needs practice, why not? Guided practice, one which comes to some of my favorite activities, such as information gaps. Find someone who. It's a way to at least put those words that you need to be used into something closer to something more communicative, and then for prior practices. So they put these 5 bits here as things that we would implement in different lessons. So it's not to say, oh, no, you have to do the 5 things in your lessons. It's unrealistic. Again, and I'm going to repeat this. We should focus on having quite realistic goals. And I really feel, again, reassured when I see these authors breaking these things down into moments, elements of our lessons. And then we can get back to Mr. Leathers here. Basically, he proposes reflection. As much as we reflect how much we speak, how much we echo our students, how clear our instructions are, what about our pronunciation? So this is something that in my experience teaching, I have asked these questions myself. So at which moments of my lessons do I usually approach pronunciation? And this is something that also I've had with teachers who just have happened to be less experienced than me. So I've had the opportunity to work with some of them. And then it's to consider, can we just try and include a few moments here and there? And why do I, sorry, I missed that nine, I'm very sorry. Why do I not teach the pronunciation items in the materials I work with? Or why do I teach them? So that's why I mentioned the example of P and V for some speakers, but then for Spanish speakers, it's gold. They have to worry about it. So it's thinking, will my students find these sound actually necessary, actually difficult, challenging? Do they need that for some specific reason? For instance, to be better understood? If so, why not consider it? And this is something that it's one of those big questions that in his paper, Levis poses lots of questions. This is my favorite one. Well, maybe not my rules. So what are my biggest concerns about teaching pronunciation? And I don't know if you feel the same, but I felt teachers mentioning confidence, and I don't feel comfortable talking about the phonetic symbols. I feel that my English is not good enough, which is really sad to hear those things, because we're professionals, we should be really proud of what we can do. And then this leads me back to my first question: at which moments of my lessons do I usually approach pronunciation? And this, I would love to hear suggestions, but I have been trying to focus, especially to give like a concrete goal, an attainable goal for teachers, which would be on teaching vocabulary and grammar. So if you're going to teach this word here, I want to teach ball. So I would include pronunciation here. I'm going to teach them how to pronounce this word. Or for grammar, if I'm teaching the past simple or past participle, I'm probably going to, okay, look at how we pronounce these forms here. And then we would have an opportunity with error correction. It's very common to hear, just when I observe a lesson with peers or with other colleagues, and I see lots of grammar being corrected. But why can we include at least some pronunciation there? Asking, okay, look at these are some of the words that we use in our class today. Let's revise how we pronounce them. It's a chance, you see, and I try to think of these as concrete ways so as to not overburden teachers with too many theoretical aspects of pronunciation, because if this is in my experience, please feel free to disagree. I've had lots of teachers say that I don't feel confident because I'm not keen on using the phonetic symbols. For those things, you might not really need that. So teaching with associations, for instance, a common word that is usually, even in advanced levels, Brazilian speakers of English usually struggle with is the word cultural, culture, which we tend to say cultural or culture. So I can say the U in this word sounds like the O in love. So I love, or I love culture. So I don't have to use the symbols for this. So I've tried, and this is something I have also been suggesting, of getting words which I'm sure students are confident producing, and see if they can use that previous knowledge to help them scaffold their own development. So should we teach pronunciation effectively? Oh yes. And these are final, this appears in his paper, and I feel really glad when I see those. And this is, I promise, the very last bit. One cannot speak without pronouncing. We need that. So we can't just skip pronunciation teaching. Everyone speaks with some kind of accent. Yes, I've always spoken Portuguese. I have my, as we call it here, my Mineiro accent. Can't help it. Yep. There's no RPGA. There's nothing. It's how we speak. We have that is an accent as well. So I don't even take the time to discuss that good or bad accent. We all have one. There's no speaking without an accent. Different factors influence L2 pronunciation, including age, the way as we mature, this has aptitude. Maybe because we have multiple intelligence to put into place here, so maybe you have some difficulties to, to hone your skills because it's muscular as well. So maybe it takes more time than other students might take. And your L1, might influence your speech in another language differently. I, for one, in Portuguese, we are famous for being very good at pronouncing nasal vowels. So when I have a vowel followed by a nasal consonant in English, I will nasalize my vowels quite often a bit because it's just such a common thing, such a strong category in Portuguese. It's really difficult for me to separate that. Thankfully, on most occasions, this doesn't cause intelligibility issues because it won't create a different category for most speakers of other languages. So, so it's a non-core character. So obviously I try because I like it, but I don't have to worry so much. Some pronunciation differences may make the speaker unintelligible to the listener, while others will not. So that's why I was talking about the dark L. It doesn't cause, it's one of the sound categories that do not cause difficulties for listeners if you use the light L. In several parts of the UK, for instance, Scotland, I think it's Western Scotland, if I'm not mistaken, you might find light L's there, or the distribution of light and dark L is different. So instead of saying real and real, sorry, why not? And maybe for Portuguese speakers, we have this local aspect because we tend to not pronounce that consonant. We turn it into something as an approximate. We say Rio or Brazil, which also happens in some varieties of English, but it might help us to acquire this category for listening because many speakers share it. Each learner in class will have unique needs that should be assessed. Maybe you have a student with a lisp, so they have to pay different kind of attention to that. Maybe you have multiple nationalities in your group, so maybe one student will struggle with short and long vowels, others will not because their language have that too. So it's paying attention. We pay attention to, so it's include pronunciation. It's about inclusivity here. We include grammar. We include patterns of interaction. Pronunciation is there. Pronunciation teaching will be most successful, and it involves a variety of ways to practice. As that's why I used Sosmasia's paper in those 5 aspects. So there's more to it. It's not just that, right? It's not just drilling. It's not just IPA. No, it's everything is part of our community of practice. And pronunciation teachers improve their practice through reflective practice. So when you think of those questions that I showed you before, what do I find most challenging? What should I teach? What should I not teach? Practice will help us. Yeah, this is something that I just, back a few years ago, I'm not the most experienced teacher in the world. I've been teaching for 12 years now. So it's quite a while for me, but I bet that people here with 20, 30 years experience from okay, I'm not the most in the world. But I remember saying B and V, why should I teach that? Or V and W. At least I think I can skip that. But now I know that, for instance, V and W might be useful for Polish and German speakers, B and D for Spanish speakers. But then A and E, very useful for speakers of my language. So we have those. So hopefully those, this shows that this is doable, this is attainable, and it's far less of knowing technicalities, it's far less about knowing incredible copious amount of memorized information. Is shaping your practice, thinking of our needs and our students' needs. And I'll be able to share this. So if you are curious about these references, I have them here. And the ones you see, the hyperlink, is because they are available on ResearchGate. So I try to choose as much as possible. I try to choose references that will be easily achieved, accessed to everyone. Sosmasia is not as much, but her book is all over the place. So hopefully you wouldn't find it too difficult to find for you. So I think this is it. And I would like to thank you all very much. And let's hope I can, I don't know, discuss it with you. Please, thanks.
Thank you, Victor. Thanks everybody for being here. And of course, we have time for questions, and we do have questions. Let me start with the very first. Lucy asked, what is VOT? What is VOT? I'm not sure at which point of the presentation you covered that. You covered that, to be honest.
Yeah, it was just when I talked about voicing and voiceless.
Mm-hmm.
VOT is as an acoustic measure. And this is to say, for instance, it's when we pronounce a consonant in a language, the VOT is this distance between when we articulate the consonant and to the next segment. So it's to say that in English, for instance, the VOT is such that the P is like in pet. So we have a certain VOT, and the P in my language, I say pet or petch. That's how I pronounce it. So pet, petch, bet, betch. It's to say that the way I categorize the consonants using VOT is just something that we do acoustically. It's what people have been using to identify learners' production in an of the consonant in an L2. So it's very common for languages that don't have aspiration that our VOT of our voiceless consonants will sound actually like voiced consonant for English speakers. So my P in betchy will sound like the B in bet. So this idea of knowing about VOT is more of an acoustic thing. But if you don't mind looking into it, it's called voice onset time. And basically it's what underlies the difficulty that might occur in being understood when we pronounce a voiceless consonant in English, and then people perceive it as a voiced one. It's because of our VOT. hope this kind of helps.
Thank you. Our very own Beata asks, what do you imagine a perfect intelligibility pronunciation handbook should look like? 3 to 5 models for each sound.
Perfect intelligibility book. All right. One that would cover, I'm just giving an answer. It's an answer, but one that would cover the core modules. So taking the time to, okay, here are the core modules, and with room for the non-core, especially for listening development. If it's a book on pronunciation, right? If that's the, but if
I think she mentions like a course book.
Course book. All right.
I don't know. I think that's what she mentioned, but I'm not sure.
In my experience, I haven't seen that, but I would include in the teacher's notes. Why do I include this pair of sounds here? I haven't seen this very often. Please, if you have, tell me, because I would love to see teachers' guides with that. B and V, okay, this is especially useful for Spanish speakers. If not, use this activity instead. I mean, teachers' guides are so rich, why, because I understand you have to sell to the whole world, but
come on, right? Publishers, you can do better.
Yeah, we don't have to know that German speakers that need this. I need to find it, right?
We have another question from Abraiz. Hi, Abraiz. And just a reminder, if you still got questions, we have some minutes, so drop them in the Q&A box, please. So Abraiz asks, can we say that the more varieties of English pronunciation become accepted worldwide, like the way Russians pronounce, for example, the less we tend to focus on standard pronunciation rules for those sounds or features?
Yeah, one of the suggestions, this is on this paper, Teaching Pronunciation for English as a Lingua Franca. It's to consider what, it's not to consider, okay, how do RP speakers sound? It's a matter of considering what characteristics should we at least try and share to establish effective communication. So maybe for instance, depending on the context, the palatalization won't cause difficulty. So the palatalization of T in saying to or tune, well, we need it. So it's just a matter of, okay, we don't need it all in all contexts. So for example, I can only think of cases where you would do it, but it's a matter of using the context, and it's to consider that we shouldn't have an unattainable model as a goal, but rather one that is achievable, which is why Jenkins and other authors, and Cacho as well, suggest these core signs, these core characteristics, because it's something we can do. Some things we won't be able to because, well, we're not born there. So that would be something for us to consider here.
Right. So some people have mentioned, Lucy actually asked here in the chat, ship and sheep, those lists of problematic sounds by nationality. I'm not really sure. I know the book, but I don't quite remember. Gemma mentioned Swan's Learn New English, which is a great resource at, like, especially at initial teacher training qualifications, such as for TESOL, CELTA. And of course, we can never forget Robin's book, Robin Walker's Teaching the Pronunciation of English as a Lingua Franca. We love Robin, and this is such a fantastic book. And I love that the way that he talks about it, I think unlike Swan, is like less prescriptive and more like descriptive. So I like that approach. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? Abraiz says, thanks. Yes, I don't think we do. So before we go, we have last minute announcements. So let me just share my screen for a second. Can you write the full name of this Robin's book? Maybe somebody could take over the chat, and it is called Teaching the Pronunciation of English as a Lingua Franca. It's by Oxford University Press. And let me share some info about our SIG, because if you're not a PronSIG member yet, you've got to join us. So we have this beautiful slide, actually prepared by Victor. Even when he's not working, he wears so many hats. Okay, so I think you can see the slide. Can you? Awesome. So Victor, once again, thank you very much for such insightful and interesting things that you shared with us today. And we had a lot of interesting discussions in the chat box as well. So we hope that you folks have enjoyed his presentation as much as we have. And before you go, if you're not a member of PronSIG yet, ask yourself, why not? As you can see from our slides, with annual membership to IATEFL, you can choose to become a member of our SIG. So as a member, you get access to great benefits, including access to our members only journal Speak Out, which is published twice a year, reduced price entry to our conferences, free events such as this one, and the ability to apply for PronSIG scholarships. But better than this, you'll be joining an amazing community of teachers who are passionate, super passionate about this subject, and rubbing shoulders with experts such as Victor. So alternatively, if you want to contribute, please get in touch. We're looking for webinar content for 2022 and beyond, so email us at pronsig@iatefl.org to discuss your ideas with us further. Don't forget, we are everywhere. Our social media team, Rachel, George, Beata, they are wonderful. So we are everywhere. We are on LinkedIn, we are on YouTube, on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, you name it. So make sure you follow us. Thank you very much for coming. And we hope to see you all next time. Our next webinar is fast approaching. And do we say the speaker already?
Why not? Should we, or should we be mysterious?
Should we, or should, I think we should be mysterious.
All right. So stay tuned.
Stay tuned, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.